Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren and today we're going to do some things a little different. Instead of talking tea, we're going to talk some books. Okay, so grab yourself a nice cup of tea and get settled in, and I am going to talk today about all of the books that I listened to in November. Yes, I know we are halfway through December, and that means that this is way overdue, so please forgive me and let's get to it. So the first book I'm going to talk about today is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Now, as an American, I would say her name is Evelyn Hardcastle, but when I was listening to the book, he was calling her Evelyn, and so that is what I will be using for this review. So I listened to this book after I heard about it from watching multiple booktubers talk about it, and it sounded right up my alley. I heard one booktuber describe it as Gosford Park meets Groundhog Day, and I would say that is a pretty darn accurate depiction of what this is. If you like closed room mysteries, if you like trying to figure out a story from multiple perspectives, this is a really interesting take on that narrative. To give a general overview, you start the story in the woods, not knowing who you are, and as time passes, you discover that this person is actually traveling from person to person each day and seeing the day unfold from that person's perspective. And the goal is to try and stop a murder from happening. The entire time I was listening to this book, I kept thinking to myself, thank goodness this is an audiobook and not me trying to read a hard copy of this, because there was a lot of confusing plot points. And I just knew that if I had been trying to read it, I would not have been able to follow it as well. And then after listening to some reviews of people on this book, I discovered that actually a lot of people do have that experience when reading the book. So of all of the books that I'm going to mention today, this is the one book that I would highly recommend trying to do with the audio. So when I read mysteries, I do tend to figure out who the killer is or what the big twist is going to be fairly early on in the story. So whenever a book can actually keep that information from me, that is always a really great sign. I can say that I did figure out a lot of what the ending and the twists were, not all of them, and I can't say that I was necessarily blown away by the twists, but I still very much enjoyed the book. I think this book actually got a lot of hype, and so people were kind of going into it with massive expectations. And for me, I'm always just looking for a good story, and I feel this was accomplished. I would recommend listening to this book or reading this book if you are a fan of thrillers and mysteries, locked door specifically, multiple perspective. Yeah, give this one a try. So the next book I'm going to talk about today is An Unwanted Guest. Now, I heard about this book from a booktuber. I'll link her information down below. It's somebody I recently started following, and she doesn't like super scary or violent mysteries, but she does like a good cozy mystery, a good science fiction young adult. So a lot of the things I've been reading are actually coming based off of recommendations from her. So An Unwanted Guest takes place in a hotel. It's the middle of a snowstorm. They get snowed in and they wake up and someone has died. And they are trapped in this hotel with no power, no way to get out, no way for people to know what's going on. And so they kind of just have to wait it out and survive until the snow clears out enough that they can get the power back on, they can get telephone lines, they can get the police up to them. This is like a very easy, quick mystery to get through. I was able to figure out what was happening, but it was still a very entertaining read. And at one point I got super creeped out while listening to this. I think part of it was because I was listening to it in the dark. I ended up having to walk down the dark hallway afterwards, and I think I just creeped myself out. And it was just one of those things where it just I don't normally get creeped out by books, but something about the description of it. They were walking down a hallway. I was walking down a hallway. It was super creepy. It gave me the chills. I definitely felt like eyes were watching me. So that was an experience. So if you like being slightly creeped out about the idea of eyes watching you in the dark, this is a good choice. The next book was The Testaments. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have been talking about this since it was released a few months ago. I was late to the Handmaid's Tale bandwagon. Long after the show was released, I purchased the audiobook and I never got around to listening to it. I finally listened to the audiobook earlier this year. So when I listened to The Handmaid's Tale, I was so disturbed and so depressed listening to it. It's just the climate of our world right now, it's not great to read something that feels like it was written for a potential near future. It's just not the greatest feeling in the world when you're reading a book. It's what everyone says it is. It was depressing and it felt way too close to home. But like everyone else, I wanted to know what happened to Offred. And so when I heard that The Testaments was coming out, I immediately pre-ordered it. And it's taken me a few months to actually be able to listen to it, but I had time in November, and it was actually the last thing that I listened to in November. For me, it did not disappoint. I was very happy with how the story continued on from multiple perspectives. That was very interesting. And the fact that one of the aunts is one of the perspectives that you're hearing from, I found absolutely fascinating. I could not get enough of hearing from the aunt's perspective. It was absolutely my favorite perspective I was listening to. And I do feel like there were some flaws, kind of lots of conveniences in the plot, but I mean, I just went with it. Like, I don't feel any need to judge the book very harshly. There were some moments where I was just kind of rolling my eyes at some of the characters and some of the plot points that were happening, but definitely 100% worth reading if you've read The Handmaid's Tale and you want to hear more in this world. The aunt's perspective 100% makes this book worthwhile. And I would be absolutely interested in hearing more short stories from it. Anytime Margaret Atwood wants to revisit these characters, I am here for it. Okay, so another book that I listened to last month was called Shriek. This was a memoir that I have had in my Audible library for a long time, and I finally got around to listening to it, and I am so glad I did. I so enjoyed listening to Lindy's story because as a woman, and a plus size woman at that, it's incredibly important to hear from other women who have been able to overcome the judgment and the often vile things people think and say to you, how you're treated, and to be able to, in this age of self-love and woman empowerment, this was a really great perspective to hear from. I had known that the book had been adapted into a television show and I had been interested in watching it, but I'm so limited on the time that I have available that I just haven't made the time to watch the show. But after listening to the book, I watched the first 2 episodes of the show, and it is very much like the book. So if you've not read the book, the show so far, I feel, is a fairly good representation of what the book is trying to accomplish. What I found really interesting about it was this constant going back to the internet culture of comments and how nobody really takes responsibility for policing that. And it's just kind of the Wild West. It's always been the Wild West, and it still is the Wild West. And it, from the people who receive the most vileness, journalists and people who put themselves out there onto the internet, the amount of ugliness that can be spewed from behind a keyboard is shocking and disturbing, and people can be quite frankly terrible. And it's interesting that there is still very little to be done about that. So I feel like that's an interesting conversation that we should continue to have, because the internet's not going anywhere. And I suppose there's always been hate mail and threats of violence against people who have put themselves out into the public, but you would think that more would be done to try and stop it now that people are so easily accessible through the internet. So just food for thought. So another book I listened to was called My Sister, the Serial Killer. This is a novella, and at first, when I started listening to it, I thought it was based on a true story. Happy to say, not so much, because nobody wants there to be serial killers, right? Nobody wants there to be serial killers, right, Lauren? Right? That's right. That's what a normal person would say. But I really enjoyed this story. I thought the characters were so interesting. It's about a woman whose sister is a serial killer and how she hates this, but also feels a responsibility to protect and help her, because that's what she's done her entire life. And then things start to unravel when the serial killer's sister becomes interested in someone at the sister's place of work who she also feels very strongly about. And the sister is yet again sitting on the sidelines, but now it's involving the man that she is interested in. So it develops into this really interesting perspective of her trying to manage her feelings towards her sister, her feelings towards this man, her feelings just in general. And I found it entertaining. It's very like dark humor. And I also found the flashbacks to her childhood were really interesting. So I would highly recommend checking this one out. It's a quick, short read, but very... I would love to see more from this writer. And the last book I'm going to talk about today is Everything is Figureoutable by Marie Forleo. I found out about Marie Forleo earlier this year. And so if you've never heard of Marie Forleo, she is a woman who back in the early 2000s, in the early days of life coaching, became a life coach. And now she has built a business around teaching other people how to build a business. And she inspires people and lifts them up, does life coaching, does business school, does business strategy and how to your dreams into reality. And I really like her attitude and her approach to things. I have taken a couple of classes on, writing business plans and how to get started over the last 10 years as a voiceover talent trying to build my business. And it's not that Marie is saying anything new, but I find that when you're in this kind of thing in particular, you need to find the right person who tells you the information in the right way. And I think if Marie's vibe is your vibe, then I think you could really benefit from listening to her free content, listening to this book. Just in general, this book was interesting. I think she's a cool, sassy lady. And I like the idea that everything is figureoutable. As someone who tends to lean into perfectionism, I do find that one of my biggest obstacles in my business and in life in general is feeling like I'm not doing it right. I'm not doing it the best way, that it's not perfect, and that keeps me from pulling the trigger on a lot of things. And I really like this simple idea of everything is figureoutable. So if you are someone who is struggling with trying to get a business idea off the ground, or if you are just looking to be re-inspired in your current business, then I would say this is a really great book to listen to kind of give you a little kick in the pants realness with Marie. She'll give it to you straight, and I appreciate that about her. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. That's all I read in November, and when I say read, I do mean listen, because I don't read books anymore. I listen to books. And I'm okay with that. Leave a comment down below if you have read one of these books, and if you have any recommendations on what I should put on my TBR. I am currently 4 books in to December. So I will have a what I listened to in December, hopefully in early January and not halfway through January. And if you like hearing about what I've been listening to, give this video a thumbs up so I know that I should keep doing videos like this. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me. Bye.